Some men arrange childcare. Others bring their problems to work.
Why did you let him say that?
This is an Aldridge cut. You're Caleb Hart, the man behind the Marchetti floating stage. People thought you retired.
Your contract is terminated, effective immediately. The shipment delay wasn't mine. The invoice proves it, Sid. I never authorized this.
I found 8 payments, $4,217.83 every time. Who owns North Shore Advisory? Miles Draper.
She built her entire defense around a man she's personally involved with.
Then explain why money entered a company you secretly owned before my father died.
Thanks for watching. Follow A Brighter Destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Caleb Hart knelt by the ceremony arbor at 7:14 in the morning, running his thumb along a joint that did not need checking. Crew hadn't arrived yet. The dew was still sitting heavy on the grass, and the whole orchard smelled like wet bark and cut pine. He liked it best this way, before anyone showed up to tell him what he already knew how to do. Nobody was watching yet. Bellwood Orchard Estates sat on 400 acres outside Willow Creek, Michigan. Cherry trees, planted 2 generations back by a man named Arthur Whitfield, turned into one of the state's most photographed wedding venues by his daughter, Grace Alden, after the fruit alone stopped paying the taxes. Grace had inherited the place 11 months earlier when her father passed, and the will was specific down to the day. 12 months of sole authority, no board approval required for anything short of selling the land outright. After that, 7 people who had known her since she was 6 years old would vote on everything, including whether she still belonged at the head of the table. She had 4 weeks left on that clock, and she knew it the way you know a toothache is coming back. Caleb had been hired 90 days earlier to rebuild the ceremony stage and the arbor behind it. One of 6 contractors Grace's assistant had lined up before she picked him specifically. His bids were honest. His joints didn't need a second look. He showed up at 6:40 every morning and drove home at dusk to a 9-year-old named Jonah, who ate cereal for dinner more nights than either of them wanted to admit. What nobody at Bellwood knew, because Caleb had never once brought it up in 3 months of coffee and sawdust, was that he'd spent 11 years building ceremony stages for some of the most photographed weddings on the East Coast. There had been a floating platform over a koi pond in the Hamptons that ran in 3 trade write-ups. There had been a joint technique with his name half attached to it, the kind carpenters 2 states away still talked about without knowing who'd invented it. He hadn't touched any of that world in 6 years. Not since the same month his wife, Rebecca, died. And 40 weeks a year on the road stopped being something 2 people could split and started being something no 9-year-old should have to survive alone. Remember that number, 6 years it matters later, by 8 a.m. The rest of the crew had rolled in, and so had Miles Grace Draper, Grace's second cousin, the man who'd handled the business side for Arthur Whitfield for 11 years, and had been leaning on the board harder than anyone expected since the funeral. Miles wore a gray suit to a job site with sawdust on the ground, tablet already open to a spreadsheet before his shoes hit gravel. Maintenance costs on the west section are up 11% from last season, Miles said to Grace. Not quite a hello. I'll have the full numbers ready for Thursday. Bring them, Grace said. I'll have mine. Miles didn't look at Caleb at all that morning, which was its own kind of message. Men like Miles Draper rarely bothered making eye contact with anyone they'd already decided didn't matter. Their first real crack came 4 days later on a Tuesday at 10:47 in the morning, when a wedding coordinator flagged a scheduling conflict on the stage timeline, and Miles used it as an excuse to walk the site with his tablet held out in front of him like a badge. You're 2 days behind, Miles said, loud enough for 3 other crew members to hear it. I don't know what kind of operation you ran out east, but out here, we finish things on schedule. Caleb didn't look up from the beam he was leveling. The stage isn't due until the 14th. I told your assistant that on Monday. I don't need a lecture from a man who fixes furniture for a living. Miles said it with the easy, reasonable tone of someone who genuinely believed he was the only adult in the conversation. Some of us built companies. Some of us swing hammers because it's the only thing left they're qualified to do. A few of the younger crew members went quiet the way people do when they're deciding whether to say something and deciding against it. Caleb set his level down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said nothing at all. He'd learned a long time ago that answering a man like Miles Draper in front of an audience only fed him more of what he wanted. Here's the thing about self-righteous men, they rarely think of themselves as cruel. Miles genuinely believed he was protecting standards. He believed every insult was a correction, every humiliation a lesson somebody desperately needed. Keep that in mind, because it explains everything that happens to him later, and none of it will feel like an accident. Grace watched the exchange from the gravel lot, arms folded, jaw tight, and said nothing in the moment either, because she'd learned that fighting Miles Draper in front of the crew only gave him a bigger stage. She'd fix it later, privately, the way she always did. What she didn't know yet was that privately was exactly where Miles preferred to operate. 3 weeks earlier, in an office with better carpeting than the one Grace used, Miles had dialed a number saved under a name that wasn't real, and told the man on the other end that the 12-month clock was almost up, that once sole authority expired the board would vote his way, that they always had. He'd asked more than once for the commission agreement to stay in writing. That detail matters. Write it down. Act 2 started the following week, and it started with a 9-year-old boy carrying a toolbox nearly as tall as he was. Jonah showed up with his father for the first time that season, set the box down carefully at the base of the arbor the way Caleb had taught him, and looked up at Grace with the particular directness only children manage. "Are you the lady who owns all the cherry trees?" "I am," Grace said. "About 6,000 of them if you count the young ones." Jonah considered the number with real seriousness, then pulled a tangle of ribbon out of his pocket, leftover trim from a wedding the week before. "Drop this. I think it belongs to a bride." Grace crouched to take it from him. "Thank you for finding it." Miles happened to be crossing the lot at that exact moment, tablet under one arm, and he didn't slow down. "Is that appropriate?" he said to Grace, not really a question, bringing a child onto an active job site. "I'd hate for something to happen, and for this company to be liable for it." "She's 9, Caleb said quietly. "He's not on the equipment." That's not really the point, is it?" Miles kept walking. "Some men manage to arrange childcare. Others bring their problems to work and expect everyone else to accommodate it." Jonah didn't understand the words, not fully, but he understood the tone, the way children always do before they understand the vocabulary. He went quiet and wandered off toward the equipment shed, narrating some private game to himself in a voice that had gone a half-step smaller than it was 5 minutes earlier. Caleb watched him go and didn't say a single word to Miles Draper. He picked his level back up. He checked a beam that didn't need checking. That's what he did instead of losing his composure, and it cost him something every single time. Grace found him 20 minutes later, alone, screwing a bracket in that was already screwed in. "You didn't have to let that go," she said. "Wasn't going to win it," Caleb said. "Men like that don't lose an argument, they just remember your name for the next one." She was right, and he had no idea yet how right he was. Humiliation kept climbing through the 3rd week, the way water finds every low spot in a floor before it finds the drain. Miles started routing Caleb's payment requests through extra approval steps that no other contractor faced. He started making comments in front of the wedding planners, always dressed up as concern, always aimed at making Caleb look like a liability instead of an asset. Once, in front of a bride's mother touring the grounds, he said, loud enough to carry, that Bellwood was working on finding more dependable family-oriented contractors for next season, glancing sideways at Caleb the entire time he said it. That one landed. Caleb didn't flinch outwardly. Inside, something old and tired shifted, the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 6 years being underestimated by people who never once asked what he used to be capable of. A branding consultant named Diane Reyes walked the grounds on a Tuesday morning that same week, camera around her neck, more interested in touching things than photographing them. She stopped cold at a seam in the stage where 2 beams met without a single visible nail. "Who built this joint?" "I did," Caleb said, coming around with the level in one hand. Diane looked at him properly for the first time. "This is an Aldridge cut." "I'd know it anywhere. I used a photograph of this exact technique in a branding deck 10 years ago." She stepped back, studying him instead of the wood now. "Sure, Caleb Hart. You did the Marchetti wedding, the floating stage over the koi pond." That ran in 3 separate trade write-ups. People in the industry assumed you'd retired rich and stopped answering emails. "Something like that," Caleb said in a tone that closed the subject as firmly as a door swinging shut. Grace, a few feet away with a seating chart in hand, went very still. She was doing math in her head. The man Miles Draper had spent 3 weeks calling unqualified, had spent 11 years building for some of the most photographed weddings on the East Coast, and had never once mentioned it, not to defend himself, not even when it would have shut Miles up cold. "You could have said something," she told him once Diane had wandered off. "It wasn't relevant to the arbor," Caleb said. "That's not why you didn't say it." Bird. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "I left that work 6 years ago, same month my wife died. It worked fine when there were 2 of us raising Jonah. Didn't work alone. He set the level down for good. I'm not hiding a career. I just didn't see the point in bringing up a version of my life that isn't mine anymore." Grace didn't repeat any of it to Miles. She wanted to see with her own eyes how far a self-righteous man would go once he'd already decided somebody was beneath correcting. She didn't have to wait long. That's Act 4, the breaking point, and it came on a Thursday at exactly 3:20 in the afternoon. A shipment of custom hardware arrived 2 days late through no fault of Caleb's, a supplier error, invoice number and all, documented and easy enough to check. Miles used it as his opening. He walked onto the site with 2 board members trailing behind him, the kind of audience he liked best, and announced, in front of the entire crew, that Bellwood was terminating Caleb's contract effective immediately, citing a pattern missed deadlines, and, in his words, conduct unbecoming of a venue this family has spent 30 years protecting. "There's no pattern," Caleb said, calm, hands steady. "There's one delayed paper trail for it that says it wasn't mine. I'm not going to stand here and be lectured about paperwork by a man who brings his kid to a job site and can't manage a delivery schedule," Miles said. "Pack your tools, I'll have someone else finish the stage." Crew went dead silent. Jonah, 30 feet away stacking scrap wood, looked up at exactly the wrong moment, old enough now to understand every word of it. Caleb didn't argue. He picked up his tools one by one, without a wasted motion, the same quiet economy he brought to everything. And Grace watched him do it with her hands curled into fists at her sides, because she had not authorized any of this and Miles Draper knew it. "I didn't approve this," Grace said, loud enough for the board members to hear. "You're a month from losing sole authority," Miles said, not even looking at her. "I'm doing you a favor, cleaning house before the vote instead of after." "Right?" That was the exact second Miles Draper crossed from self-righteous into something the whole town would remember him for. Because he hadn't just insulted a contractor, he had in front of witnesses tried to fire a man Grace hadn't authorized him to fire over a mistake that wasn't the man's mistake at all. Act 5 starts with a business card, which is the smallest and quietest way a reveal ever begins. That night, Marion Whitfield, no relation to Arthur, just a coincidence of an old Michigan surname, and Bellwood's accountant for over 2 decades knocked on Grace's office door, holding a folder against her chest the way you hold something that might come apart if you loosen your grip. She'd been chasing an odd vendor line for weeks, a consulting fee routed through a shell entity called North Shore Advisory, paid 8 separate times, always the same amount, $4,217.83. She'd traced the registered agent to a P.O. box in Traverse City and, after an evening of digging through public filings she probably wasn't technically supposed to be looking at on a Saturday, found the name behind it. Miles Draper. The brokerage filing was dated 14 months back, 3 months before Arthur Whitfield's diagnosis, 5 before he died. Miles had been arranging a commission with a resort company called Crestview Holdings to buy Bellwood's west parcel the moment sole authority expired, and he'd started arranging it while Arthur was still alive, still trusting the man across the table from him with numbers he was too tired to check himself anymore. Grace read it twice. It wasn't anger on her face when she looked up. It was exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from realizing you spent a year defending a company against a threat that had been sitting inside it the whole time, wearing a gray suit and calling itself family. Act 6 is where the layers stack, one after another, the way they're supposed to. Card came first. Diane Reyes forwarded an email from Aldridge and Rowe Events, the industry's biggest ceremony production house, requesting comment for a feature on the quiet return of the man behind the Marchetti stage. Word had gotten out, the way it always does once one person recognizes the right joint in the right piece of wood. The phone call came second. A trade magazine editor called Grace directly, asking to confirm that Caleb Hart, had been quietly working at Bellwood for 3 months, and asking almost as an afterthought whether it was true he'd recently been let go over a paperwork dispute. Grace realized in that exact moment that Miles hadn't just humiliated a good man in front of his son. He'd handed the story a headline nobody at Bellwood could control anymore. Her board confirmation came third, and it came from 3 people at once. A carpenter named Roy Ostrander, who'd worked under Miles's old vendor contracts 2 years earlier, called Marion after hearing the rumors around town, and said Miles had stiffed him nearly $6,000 on a completed job, threatening to blacklist him with every venue in 3 counties if he complained. A former Bellwood event coordinator named Priya Desai. Wait, no name changes needed there. The rule is Anglo-American names, so call her Susan Ferris. A former coordinator named Susan Ferris came forward next, saying Miles had forced her resignation 2 summers back after she raised concerns about a vendor kickback she couldn't fully explain at the time, but could now. And a third voice, a wedding photographer named Douglas Prentice, confirmed under oath during the board's formal review that Miles had pressured him into padding invoices for events tied to North Shore Advisory, splitting the difference quietly, always in cash. 3 victims, 3 separate timelines, 1 pattern, and it all traced back to the same man standing at the head of a conference table telling everyone he was protecting standards. The board convened for the final vote on a Thursday, 3 days ahead of the deadline written into Arthur Whitfield's will. Grace stood where Miles usually stood, a stack of documents in front of her instead of a slide deck, and she didn't raise her voice once through the entire presentation. Her numbers did the raising for her. Miles tried to turn it, the way self-righteous men always try, right up until the room stops believing them. "This is exactly what I warned everyone about," he said, gesturing toward the back of the room where Caleb sat at Grace's specific request. "She's built her entire defense around a man she's personally involved with. Ask yourselves whose judgment is actually compromised here. Ask yourselves," Grace said, calm and level, "why a consulting fee to a company you secretly own started showing up in our books a full year before my father died." The room went very still, the way rooms go still when everyone is doing their own private math instead of listening to the person still talking. Caleb stood when Grace nodded at him and walked to the front with the same unhurried economy he brought to any job site. He didn't talk about feelings or fairness. He talked numbers, return on renovated ceremony space, the premium paid for a working orchard over a generic banquet hall, industry day pulled from 11 years spent building for exactly this kind of venue up and down the East Coast. He dismantled every argument Miles had ever made about cost overruns the same way he dismantled a joint that had been cut wrong from the start, methodically, without malice, until there was nothing left standing behind it. An older board member, a friend of Arthur's for 30 years, looked at Miles directly for the first time all meeting. "Your uncle built half of what's sitting under this roof," he said. "Shut. I'd like to know how you sat across from him at this table and let him sign anything without telling him what you'd already agreed to behind his back." Miles tried to answer. Something about protecting shareholder value came out, thin and unconvincing, and nobody at the table was listening closely enough to catch the rest of it. "Rod, that's the thing about men like Miles Draper. Even standing in the wreckage of everything they built, they still can't bring themselves to say the 2 words that might have actually saved them. I'm sorry." He never said them, not that day, not in the review that followed, not once. Keep that in mind too. It's the whole lesson. The vote came 8-1. Miles was suspended pending formal review, then removed entirely once the fraud case moved to the county prosecutor's office 3 weeks later. North Shore Advisory's accounts were frozen. Crestview Holdings quietly withdrew its offer the moment the commission agreement surfaced in the filing, unwilling to be associated with a deal built on a hidden kickback. Miles Draper, who had spent a decade telling everyone else how to run their lives with dignity, lost his business license, his seat on 2 other local boards, and, according to Susan Ferris, most of the friends who used to return his calls. He never once, in any of it, admitted he'd been wrong. He told a local paper, months later, that he'd been protecting the company from sentimental decision-making. That was the last anyone at Bellwood heard from him directly. Act 8 is the time skip, and it's a quiet one, which is exactly how these things are supposed to end. 6 months later, Bellwood Orchard Estates had a new hiring policy Grace had written herself, one that put every contractor's payment on the same automatic 30-day schedule regardless of who they were related to. Caleb Hart was back on full-time, not because Grace pitied him but because his bids were still the most honest and his joints still didn't need a second look. He took on a handful of freelance projects with Aldridge and Rowe on his own terms too, never leaving Willow Creek for more than a long weekend, never leaving Jonah waiting on a porch for a father who called that a life. Jonah asked his father one evening, apropos of nothing, whether he was going to keep building stages at Bellwood forever. Caleb thought about New York, about the version of himself that used to fly out on a Thursday and come home on a Sunday and call that enough. Then he thought about a 9-year-old stacking scrap wood behind a shop, unbothered by anything that had happened in a boardroom he'd never seen the inside of. Yeah, Caleb said. I think I am. Harvest ended the way it always did at Bellwood, cherries stripped from the trees, the crew gathering for the small celebration Arthur Whitfield had started decades earlier, one Grace had never once considered skipping. Marion was there, finally letting herself relax after months of feeling responsible for everything the fraud case had uncovered. Therese came back, for it too, the first time she'd set foot on the property since the summer Miles forced her out. Off at the edge of the clearing, away from the tables and the string lights, Caleb had built something small, an arbor barely large enough for 2 people, unconnected to any client's order, unlisted on any invoice. Grace found it before anyone told her it was there. You'd make a great bride someday, Caleb said, the same words he'd said to her the very first week they met, except nothing about his voice was the same as it had been that first afternoon. And I suppose, Grace said, I found my groom. He reached out and took her hand, the first time either of them had let it be that simple. Here's what Swiss story is actually about, underneath the arbor and the fraud and the shell company. It was never really about a stage or a signature joint or even the orchard. It was about a man who quietly outworked every insult thrown at him instead of returning them, and a system that eventually, inevitably, caught up with the one man who thought cruelty was the same thing as standards. Miles Draper never lost because Caleb Hart was secretly famous. He lost because he spent years treating a single father like he was disposable, and disposable men have a habit of turning out to be the person you needed most, standing quietly at the edge of the room the whole time. If this story meant something to you, if you know a Caleb Hart in your own life, someone quietly caring more than anyone around him, realizes, do him a favor today and treat him like he matters, before a stranger has to remind you why he always did. Kleiner. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person living or dead or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. Content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual company or institution.